Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Into the Kinoverse. I am your host, Pure Kino, and we are back with another Better Call Saul log. Today, we're looking at the fourth episode of Season 1, Hero. Now, I know it's been a little while since I've done one of these Better Call Saul logs. I apologize for the delay. I was watching the show Carnival, which is an HBO show. Really good show. I'm going to do a video on it soon, but that was taking up a lot of my time watching that. But now that I'm done with that show, we can get back to Better Call Saul logs. And to start off in this episode, we begin in a flashback to Jimmy's Slippin Jimmy days. He's back in Chicago. He's exiting a bar with a guy named Stevie. Interestingly, this is the first time that Jimmy uses the alias Saul Goodman. Although he's not using it seriously, he's kind of using it as a joke here. But this is the first mention of Saul Goodman, which will, of course, become a very big part of his identity here. Now, interestingly, what he's talking about to the guy is, before he gets into the scam itself, he's talking to him about, like, howling like a wolf during sex. It's just, kind of rapport to get him to trust him for a little bit. But what's interesting is a connection to a future episode. And I know some people get mad when I bring up future episodes here, but I want to bring it up here. We know from another episode that one of Jimmy's formative experiences was with this con man who told him that you can either be a wolf or a sheep. That would become a big part of his identity. And we'll talk about that episode when we get to it. But again, I just noticed that the talking about a wolf howl in here is kind of connected to that whole wolf mentality that Jimmy has moving forward from that encounter. But either way, they're walking down an alley, and the guy finds a wallet. It's full of $1,000, and they find that it belongs to this guy who's drunk, lying on the street. He starts insulting them, and they get pissed off, so they decide to rob him. The guy takes the wallet, and then Jimmy tries to take a Rolex watch from his wrist, but the guy knows that the Rolex watch is worth a lot more. So the deal that they come to essentially is he will give Jimmy the $1,000 that they found, and also around $500 of his own money in exchange for the Rolex, which is worth a lot more than that. But it's revealed that this is a scam that Jimmy and Marco, the guy on the ground, are running on this guy. The Rolex is fake, and this, again, was a whole setup to rob him of like $500. Now, Marco is, really happy to be a part of this. He's really excited about the scams. But Jimmy, even at this point, when he's still in the Slippin Jimmy persona, he recognizes how, like, small this scam is. Like, it's not a huge scam that's going to earn him a lot of money. It's just beer money. And we can see that he wants something more than just these small-time scams. He wants to be bigger than this. And again, this is setting up some great characterization, which will be featured throughout the show. From there, we move on back to the main timeline. Last episode, Jimmy found Craig and Betsy Kettleman in the woods, hiding from Nacho and then trying to get away from their problems. They, beg him not to turn them in, especially the money that he saw last episode, because, that would get them in trouble. And they refuse to give it back. They have their bullshit justification. They're just greedy. And ultimately, they offer him a bribe to, forget the money. He tries to instead get them to hire him as a lawyer. However, they say that he's the kind of lawyer that guilty people hire, and they don't want to be associated with him. And this will, of course, be a very big thing for Jimmy as well. This particular moment will haunt him for a long time. But he accepts the bribe ultimately, and they, come up with a story to explain why they were out in the woods. But Jimmy goes back and gets Nacho out of prison. He's still pissed off that Jimmy, informed the Kettlemans about what was going on. But Jimmy ultimately points out that, like, he would have gotten in trouble no matter what because the neighbor saw his license plate. They had the blood in the van. Like, Nacho is being very sloppy here. So, ultimately he did Nacho a favor by preventing him from doing a real crime, which would have gotten him in serious trouble. So he gets away from that. There's an interesting line that Jimmy has here when he talks to Mike. One, he thanks Mike for helping him out before with the whole thing, but he also complains that, like, criminals should be smarter than this. I think he's talking about the Kettlemans in particular, but also Nacho. And he complains that, they're not thinking these things through enough and they're not being smart about their crimes. And of course, one, we know Jimmy is very intelligent when it comes to crime and scams and stuff like that. But it also explains why he was so interested in being a part of Walt's operation because, Walt obviously did a lot of stupid things as well, but the intelligence behind their operation, what went into it, it was this much bigger deal than just your normal low-level drug dealing, is something that he was really attracted to. He wanted, to be around smart criminals like this. So I just thought that was an interesting call out. But with the money that he makes from the Kettlemans, he decides to do something in order to stir up business. So he goes to a tailor and gets a really fancy suit. Again, an interesting call out here is that when the tailor's out of the room, he looks at an orange shirt, which is, very bright and vibrant. And we, of course, know that that's going to be a part of his Saul Goodman style later on in the series. So we can see the attraction he has to very bright, vibrant colors, even this early. But after this, he essentially makes himself look like Howard from HHM. And he puts up a billboard that essentially is just copying their billboard. It's down to every single detail. And of course, HHM is pissed about this. They order a cease and desist. They take it to the judge. And ultimately, the judge rules against Jimmy and forces him to take it down. Now, Jimmy then tries to call a bunch of news agencies to get them to run the story. None of them are interested because, again, this is such a small case. Who cares about this? And ultimately, he decides to hire some local UNM students to film for him. And this is where we're introduced to them. I'll be honest, I still don't know their names after, watching the entire series multiple times. They're just the film students, but they will become not a central part of the series, but definitely recurring status throughout the rest of the series. So they film his little, news story about being wronged. But at that very moment, the guy who's taking on the billboard falls from the billboard. He's, attached to a line, but he can't get back up. He's flailing. Jimmy runs up there and saves him in front of everyone. They're recording. And it's, of course, revealed that this was all part of Jimmy's scam to make himself look like a hero, the title of the episode. Now, interestingly, the guy who's taking down the billboard was the client of Jimmy's all the way back in episode 2. We see him very briefly, but that's how Jimmy knew him. And again, that's how Jimmy's going to make a lot of his contacts throughout the underworld. It's guys he did favors for, guys he's represented, and he essentially builds up this kind of network of people to help him with his various scams and projects. So after this, Jimmy is a hero. He's, developed a lot of press. Some people see right through it, like Howard and Kim quickly see that, like, yeah, this is way too good to be true. But regardless, it looks like Jimmy's going to get some new clients from this. However, the one problem is that he's in the newspaper, and Chuck gets the newspaper every day and reads it, and he knows that Chuck will be suspicious. So he tries to hide the newspaper and pretend like it didn't get delivered, but Chuck immediately sees that's something's wrong here because all the neighbors have their newspapers, and he wraps himself in his silly space blanket and takes one of his neighbor's newspapers. He leaves $5 there as a compensation for taking a newspaper, but the neighbor lady's looking at him like crazy, like, what is this guy on drugs or something? And we know that's going to be a problem. But Chuck manages to get back home with the newspaper, still in a lot of pain from the electricity, but ultimately sees that Jimmy's on the front page and immediately recognizes something is wrong. So that's going to be a plot point moving forward here. That is the episode. We have some trivia here, though. The alias that Marco uses on the ID in the wallet that they find is the name Henry Gondorf, which is a reference to the 1973 film The Sting, which is about con men and stuff like that. So I think definitely an intentional reference there, probably on the character's part. It seems like something that Jimmy, being a movie buff, would probably have put into there. But it is time for the question of the episode. Now, this question comes to us from Mo6702, who asks, whose character arc do you like more, Saul/Jimmy or Walt's? Now, this is a very interesting question. Looking at Jimmy's character arc, I definitely think it's a lot more complicated than Walt's. Walt ultimately, like Vince pitched it, goes from Mr. Chips to Scarface. He goes from this very kind of weak person to, being this powerful drug lord. And not to say that story arc is completely simple. I think there is a lot they did in there with making it about Walt's pride rather than just being this, underdog story of a guy going from being weak to being strong. It sort of becomes a critique of the kind of power and pride that someone like Walt wants. It critiques that idea. So I think that is an interesting character arc. I think Saul and Jimmy's arc, in comparison, is a little bit more nuanced. It's not so much a straight line journey as it is a guy who wants to try to be good, but ultimately keeps failing in these ways and is pushed down these paths and goes down paths of his own choices as well. So I think his arc is a little bit more complicated in that regard. However, I will say that, Walt's arc is very well paced and there's not a lot of distraction. So it's very smooth and you can really focus on it throughout the entire series. I think in the later half of Better Call Saul, Jimmy's story kind of gets distracted by some of the other plot lines they have going on, specifically the cartel storyline. And you guys know my thoughts about Lalo and the cartel storyline and how much I hate that plot point. And I think that kind of distracts from Jimmy's character journey. So I'd say that I probably like Saul and Jimmy's story arc a little bit better than Walt's, but I prefer the execution better in Breaking Bad compared to Better Call Saul. But ultimately, I still do love both shows. So it's just a slight preference. They're both fantastic pieces of television. And thank you so much for the question, Mo. And that is pretty much the episode. Thank you guys so much for listening to this, and stay tuned for the next Better Call Saul log coming soon.